"Don't touch him, he's dirty." The woman's voice sliced clean through the afternoon air, sharp enough to turn heads, quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant to hurt, and Ethan Carter felt it land anyway as he stood there on the cracked sidewalk, fingers wrapped around the last sandwich he had, the paper bag already empty except for a few crumbs clinging to the bottom like they didn't want to let go, like he didn't either. The smell of toasted bread and cheap deli meat still lingered, warm against the cool October breeze, and his stomach tightened in a slow, hollow twist that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with the fact that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. But he didn't move, not yet, because a few feet away, slumped against a cold metal bench, sat a man no one else seemed to see, his coat too thin for the weather, his hands trembling just slightly as they rested on his knees, eyes fixed somewhere low, somewhere distant, like he had learned a long time ago that looking up didn't change anything. Traffic hummed past in steady waves, tires whispering over asphalt, doors slamming, heels clicking, conversations rising and falling in fragments. But around that small space, something felt still, like the world had drawn a quiet line and decided what mattered and what didn't, and Ethan stood right on the edge of it, feeling the weight of that choice press into his chest. He shifted his grip on the sandwich, the wrapper crinkling softly, the sound louder than it should have been, and for a second, just 1 second, he thought about turning away, about walking the extra 3 blocks home, about saving it for later when the hunger would hit harder, when the apartment would feel colder and the lights would flicker like they always did when the power dipped. But then the man coughed, a dry, shallow sound that didn't ask for attention but carried anyway, and Ethan's eyes lifted, meeting his for the briefest moment, and there it was, not desperation, not even hope, just a quiet kind of need that didn't expect to be answered. Behind him, the woman pulled her child closer, her heels tapping faster now, her voice lowering into a whisper that still carried enough to sting. And somewhere across the street, a man in a dark coat paused near a black SUV, watching without stepping forward, his expression unreadable under the shadow of the late afternoon sun. Ethan exhaled slowly, the air leaving his lungs in a thin stream that fogged just slightly in the cooling air, and then he moved, not fast, not dramatic, just a few simple steps forward until he was close enough to see the lines in the man's face, the faint shake in his fingers, the way his shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. Ethan crouched down, the concrete cold beneath his sneakers, and without saying anything, he unwrapped the sandwich halfway, breaking it unevenly, his smaller piece barely more than a few bites, and held the larger half out with a steady hand, his voice quiet but clear when it finally came. "Here, you can have this," and for a moment, the world didn't react, didn't reward, didn't punish. It just held its breath as the man looked at the food, then at the boy, like he was trying to understand something that didn't make sense anymore, something simple, something forgotten, and Ethan didn't look away, even as his stomach tightened again, even as the smell grew stronger in the cold air, because something deeper, something steadier than hunger, had already made the decision for him. The man did not take it right away, his fingers hovering just inches from the bread as if the space between them carried more weight than the city around them, and Ethan kept his arm steady even as a faint tremor worked its way through his wrist, not from fear but from the quiet strain of holding on to something he had already decided to let go, the paper wrapper fluttering softly in the breeze, catching a sliver of sunlight that slipped between tall glass buildings and painted everything in a thin, golden edge. Finally, slowly, the man reached out, his hand rough and cold against Ethan's for the briefest second, and when he took the sandwich, he did not speak, he only nodded once, small and deliberate, like the kind of gratitude that did not rely on words because it had been waiting too long to be felt, and Ethan gave a slight nod back, almost instinctive, before lowering himself onto the edge of the bench beside him, his smaller half of the sandwich resting loosely in his hand, already cooling, already less than it had been a moment ago. Across the street, engines idled low, a steady vibration beneath the noise of passing traffic, and the man in the dark coat had not moved, his posture straight, his gaze fixed in a way that did not belong to someone simply passing through. But Ethan did not notice him, not really, because his focus drifted inward now, toward the quiet ache settling deeper in his stomach, toward the rhythm of his own breathing as he lifted the small piece of bread and took a careful bite, chewing slowly, making it last, the taste plain but grounding, something familiar in a day that felt otherwise too sharp around the edges. The man beside him ate differently, faster at first, then slowing, as if remembering that food did not have to be rushed away, crumbs falling onto his coat, his shoulders loosening just slightly with each bite, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty but full, like something shared without needing to be explained. A bus hissed to a stop nearby, doors folding open with a mechanical sigh, people stepping off, stepping around them, stepping past them, some glancing briefly, most not at all, the world continuing in its steady forward motion, indifferent and consistent, and Ethan felt it again. That quiet separation, like he and the man beside him, existed just a few inches outside of everyone else's line of sight. When the last bite was gone, Ethan brushed his hands together, small crumbs falling to the pavement, and stood up, his legs a little lighter, a little unsteady, but he straightened anyway, adjusting the worn straps of his backpack over his shoulders, the fabric thin at the seams from years of use, and he looked down at the man once more, offering a small, almost shy smile that did not expect anything in return. The man met his eyes this time, fully, and there was something different there now, something clearer, as if a layer of distance had quietly lifted, and he spoke, his voice low and careful. "Thank you," the words simple, but they carried, settling into the space between them with a kind of weight that lingered even after Ethan nodded and turned away. He walked slowly at first, then a little faster, hands tucked into the pockets of his hoodie as the wind picked up, weaving through the rhythm of the street, past storefronts with bright windows and polished reflections, past people who did not know his name and would not remember his face, and behind him, across the street, the man in the dark coat finally moved, one step forward, then another, his phone already in his hand, his expression no longer unreadable but focused, precise, as he watched the small figure disappear into the flow of the city, something shifting quietly in his eyes, something that had not been there before. The wind followed him down the block, slipping through the loose seams of his hoodie and brushing cold against his skin, but Ethan kept walking, one step after another, his sneakers scraping lightly against the uneven sidewalk as the city shifted around him from polished storefronts to quieter streets where the glass gave way to brick and the noise softened into distant traffic and the occasional hum of an air conditioner unit rattling in a window above. His stomach tightened again, sharper now. A hollow pull that came in slow waves, and he pressed his hand briefly against it, not to stop it but to acknowledge it, like something familiar that he had learned to carry without complaint, and he kept moving, turning left at the corner where the streetlight flickered even in daylight, then right past a row of mailboxes dented at the edges, their metal doors clinking softly whenever someone opened one. Behind him, several blocks away, the man in the dark coat stood beside the black SUV, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and controlled. "I want everything you can find on that kid," he said, eyes still fixed in the direction Ethan had disappeared, where he lives, who he lives with, school, medical records, everything. And there was a pause, just long enough for the weight of the request to settle on the other end, before he added, quieter, "No mistakes," and ended the call without waiting for a response, sliding the phone back into his coat pocket as the engine of the SUV purred steadily behind him, the driver glancing in the rearview mirror but saying nothing. Ethan did not see any of it, did not hear the quiet shift that had begun far outside his world, because by the time the sun dipped lower and stretched long shadows across the narrow street he lived on, he was already climbing the worn concrete steps to his apartment building, each step carrying the faint echo of years of use, the metal railing cool beneath his hand as he pushed open the heavy door that stuck slightly at the bottom. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of old paint and something cooking from a distant unit, the light above flickering once before settling into a dim, steady glow, and Ethan moved down the corridor with quiet familiarity, counting the doors without looking, stopping at the one with a small scratch near the handle, the paint chipped just enough to reveal the wood beneath. And he reached into his pocket, pulling out a key that had been worn smooth at the edges, turning it carefully in the lock before stepping inside. The apartment was small, just over 500 square feet, the air warmer but still thin, carrying the soft hum of a space heater working harder than it should, and from the corner of the room, his mother looked up from the couch, a blanket draped over her legs, her face tired but softening the moment she saw him. "You are home early," she said, her voice gentle, and Ethan gave a small nod, slipping off his shoes by the door. "Yeah," he answered, keeping it simple, his eyes drifting briefly to the kitchen counter where nothing new had been added, the same empty space where groceries should have been, and he moved closer, setting his backpack down with care before sitting beside her, the couch dipping slightly under his weight. She studied him for a second, her gaze lingering just long enough to notice the quiet in his movements, the way he folded his hands together. Instead of reaching for anything, "Did you eat?" she asked, not sharply, not accusing, just a question carried on concern, and Ethan hesitated for the smallest moment, the memory of the sandwich still fresh in his mind, the warmth of it, the smell, the way it had felt to let it go, and then he nodded again, a soft, practiced motion. "Yeah, I ate," he said, his voice steady, and she smiled faintly, relieved enough to let it go, leaning back against the cushion as the light outside dimmed further, casting long shadows across the room, across the city. The man in the dark coat stood now inside a quiet office, floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the fading sky, a tablet in his hand displaying the first pieces of information already coming in, a name, an address, a school record, each detail appearing one by one, and he read them without expression at first, but as the picture formed, something in his posture shifted, something subtle but undeniable, like a line being redrawn in a place he had not expected, and for a long moment, he did not speak, did not move, just stood there in the fading light, looking at the life of a boy who had given away his last meal without hesitation, and realizing that what he had witnessed on that sidewalk had not been small at all. The night settled slowly over the city, not with silence but with a softer kind of noise, the distant hum of traffic blending with the occasional siren far enough away to feel like part of the background rather than a disruption, and inside the small apartment, Ethan sat at the narrow kitchen table with a glass of tap water in front of him, the condensation forming faint lines down the side as his fingers traced them absent-mindedly. His stomach still tight, still hollow, but quieter now, as if it had accepted the decision he had made earlier, and across from him, his mother shifted slightly under the thin blanket, her breathing steady but shallow, the television casting a muted glow across her face, the volume turned low to save on electricity, and he watched her for a moment, just long enough to make sure she was comfortable, before looking away, his gaze settling on the empty counter again. The absence there louder than anything else in the room, he stood after a while, moving carefully so the floor would not creak too much, and walked to the sink, rinsing the glass even though it was already clean, the sound of running water filling the small space, giving him something to focus on, something to do, and when he turned it off, the quiet returned immediately, heavier this time, pressing gently against the walls, and he dried his hands on a worn towel before stepping toward the window, pushing it open just enough to let the cool air slip in, carrying with it the distant scent of rain that had not yet fallen, miles away. In a high-rise office where the light still burned long after most floors had gone dark, the man in the dark coat stood by the window, the city stretching out beneath him in sharp lines of white and red, his reflection faint against the glass as he scrolled through the report on his tablet, each detail confirming what he had already begun to understand. Ethan Carter, age 12, honor student, attendance nearly perfect despite frequent absences tied to medical appointments that were not his own, a mother with a chronic illness, limited income, no consistent support, and he paused there, his thumb hovering just above the screen as he looked back out at the city, the same city that had allowed a boy like that to go unnoticed, to go hungry, to give away his last meal without anyone stepping in before or after. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging the glass for just a second before disappearing, and behind him, a voice broke the quiet. "Sir, the board is asking if you will still attend tomorrow's meeting." And he did not turn right away, did not answer immediately, because his focus had shifted somewhere else entirely, somewhere smaller but heavier, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but different, less distant. "Reschedule it," he said, simple and final, and the assistant hesitated just a fraction before nodding, "Yes, sir," and stepping back out, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered. Back in the apartment, Ethan closed the window halfway, the chill settling in just enough to make the room feel less stale, and he returned to the couch, sitting carefully beside his mother, pulling the edge of the blanket up over her shoulder when it slipped, his movements gentle, practiced, and he leaned back, resting his head against the wall, eyes drifting closed for a moment as the day caught up with him, the weight of it settling into his bones, not heavy with regret, but with a quiet kind of exhaustion that came from choosing something harder when something easier had been right there in his hands. Across the city, the man turned from the window at last, setting the tablet down on his desk with deliberate care, his mind already moving ahead. Not in the usual calculations of numbers and outcomes, but in something less familiar. Something that did not fit neatly into reports or projections, and he reached for his phone again, dialing without hesitation. "I want a team ready by morning," he said when the line connected, his tone leaving no room for delay. "Transportation, legal, medical, everything." And there was a pause on the other end, then a cautious, "For what purpose, sir?" And he looked back out at the city one more time before answering, his voice steady, "Because tomorrow, "We are going to that address," and he ended the call, the decision already set, the night outside stretching on, unaware that by morning, something quiet and unseen was about to shift in a way the city would not forget. Morning arrived without ceremony, just a thin wash of pale light slipping through the cracked blinds and stretching quietly across the worn floor, and Ethan woke before the alarm, his eyes opening slowly as if his body already knew there was no reason to rush, the room still cool from the night air that had lingered, and for a moment he lay still, listening to the soft hum of the space heater and the distant rumble of an early bus rolling past outside. His stomach already awake before the rest of him, pulling tight again with that familiar, empty ache, but he did not react to it, not outwardly, he simply pushed himself up, feet touching the cold floor, and moved through the small space with quiet intention, careful not to wake his mother as he reached for his backpack, checking its contents out of habit even though he knew there was nothing new inside. In the kitchen, the counter remained unchanged, the same blank stretch where groceries should have been, and he paused there for a second, his fingers resting lightly against the edge, then he turned away, filling a glass with water and drinking it slowly, letting it settle, letting it do what little it could, and when he set the glass down, he exhaled softly and adjusted the sleeves of his hoodie before heading toward the door. Outside, the air carried a sharper chill, the kind that hinted at colder days ahead, and the street was already beginning to wake, cars moving in steady lines, people stepping out with purpose, their mornings already mapped out in ways Ethan had learned not to expect, and he joined the flow without drawing attention, walking the same route he always did, past the flickering streetlight, past the row of dented mailboxes, past the corner where yesterday still lingered in his memory but not in the world around him, because the bench was empty now, the space already reclaimed by routine. Several blocks away, the first SUV turned onto his street, then another, and another, dark and polished, their engines low and controlled, moving in quiet formation that did not match the rhythm of the neighborhood, and curtains shifted behind windows as people noticed, subtle at first, then more openly, as the line of vehicles grew, filling the narrow street with a presence that did not belong, and at the center of it, the man in the dark coat sat in the back seat, his posture composed, his gaze steady as he looked out at the passing buildings, each one bringing him closer to a place that had already begun to change. Something in him, Ethan, unaware, continued walking, his pace steady, his hands tucked into his pockets as he reached the bus stop, joining a small group of students and workers, their conversations light, their attention divided, and he stood slightly apart, not isolated but not fully part of the circle either, his focus drifting to the ground, to the faint cracks in the pavement that formed patterns he had memorized without meaning to. The bus arrived with a hiss, doors folding open, and he stepped on with the others, dropping his fare and moving toward the back, taking a seat by the window where the glass was slightly scratched, distorting the view just enough to blur the edges of passing buildings, and he leaned his head lightly against it, eyes tracing the movement outside as the city slid by. Back on his street, the SUVs came to a stop, one by one, engines idling in quiet unison, and doors opened with soft, synchronized clicks, men and women stepping out in tailored coats, their presence deliberate but restrained, as if aware that the ground beneath them carried a different weight than the polished floors they were used to. And finally, the man in the dark coat stepped out as well, his shoes meeting the pavement with a subtle, decisive sound, his gaze lifting to the apartment building ahead, the chipped paint, the worn steps, the small details that told a story no report ever fully could, and he stood there for a moment, not moving forward yet, just taking it in, the quiet of the morning wrapping around the scene, holding it in place, as if the city itself was pausing to see what would happen next. The hallway felt colder than it should have, the kind of cold that did not come from temperature but from stillness, and Ethan's mother sat upright on the couch, the blanket slipping slightly from her shoulders as she listened to the unfamiliar sound outside, engines that did not belong to this street, doors closing with a precision that did not match the usual rhythm of neighbors coming and going, and she turned her head slowly toward the window, her breath catching just a little as shadows moved across the thin curtains, shapes larger than anything that usually passed by. Outside, the line of black vehicles stretched along the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the morning light in sharp lines, and people had begun to gather at a distance, standing on stoops, peeking through blinds, their voices low but carrying, curiosity mixing with uncertainty, because nothing like this had ever arrived here without warning. The man in the dark coat stepped forward at last, his pace measured, each step deliberate against the worn concrete, his eyes taking in every detail as he approached the building, the chipped paint near the entrance, the slight sag in the railing, the door that stuck before it opened, and when he reached it, he paused, just for a second, as if acknowledging the threshold between two very different worlds. Then he pushed it open and stepped inside. The stairwell echoed softly with his footsteps, the sound traveling upward in a way that made the space feel even narrower, and behind him, one of his team members followed at a respectful distance, carrying a slim folder, while the rest remained outside, their presence steady but restrained, inside the apartment. Ethan's mother stood now, one hand resting against the wall for balance, her eyes fixed on the door as the faint echo of footsteps reached her, growing clearer with each second, and there was no fear in her expression, only uncertainty, the kind that comes when something unknown approaches but has not yet revealed its intention. The knock came gently, not loud, not demanding, just 3 soft taps that seemed almost out of place against the tension in the air, and for a moment, everything held still, the hum of the heater, the distant noise of the street. Even her own breathing felt suspended, and she moved slowly toward the door, each step careful, her hand reaching for the handle with a hesitation that lasted just long enough to matter before she turned it and opened the door halfway. The man stood there, composed, his presence quiet but unmistakable, his coat perfectly fitted, his expression calm, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the contrast between them clear but not spoken. And then he inclined his head slightly, a gesture of respect that did not feel practiced but intentional. "Good morning," he said, his voice even, carrying none of the distance it had held the day before. "My name is Richard Hale," and the name seemed to settle into the small space between them, unfamiliar but heavy with something she could not yet place, and she blinked once, processing, her grip on the door tightening just slightly as she responded, her voice soft but steady, "Can I help you?" And he held her gaze, not looking past her, not looking around, just present in that moment as he answered, "I believe I met your son yesterday," and the word shifted something immediately, subtle but undeniable, and her posture changed just a fraction. Her attention sharpening. "Ethan," she asked, and he nodded once, slow and certain, "Yes," and for a second, the world outside, the vehicles, the people watching, all of it faded into the background, leaving only the quiet weight of that connection, and the reason he had come, standing there at her door, waiting, not as a man above her, but as someone who had seen something he could not ignore. Her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the door, not out of fear but out of the quiet weight of uncertainty, and for a moment she studied him more closely, the clean lines of his coat, the stillness in the way he stood, the absence of urgency in his posture despite everything outside, and she opened the door a little wider, just enough to acknowledge that whatever this was, it was not leaving quickly. "What about my son?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with a protective instinct that had been sharpened over years, and Richard did not step forward, did not cross the threshold without invitation. He simply remained where he was, the morning light catching faintly along his shoulder as he answered, "Yesterday, on Maple and 3rd, he gave something away," and the words were simple, almost understated, but they carried a clarity that made her pause, her mind already searching through possibilities, through small acts that might not have seemed worth mentioning, and she exhaled slowly. "He does that," she said, not as an excuse, not as a boast, just as a quiet truth, and something in Richard's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to soften the distance that had once defined him. "He gave his last meal," he said, and the specificity of it landed differently, heavier, and she blinked, her gaze lowering for just a second before lifting again. A mixture of understanding and concern passing through her eyes. "He did not tell me that," she replied, more to herself than to him, and for a moment, the space between them held that realization, the quiet knowledge of a choice made without expectation. Outside, a car door closed softly, the sound echoing faintly up the stairwell, and down the street, neighbors lingered just a little longer than usual, drawn by something they could not fully explain, and inside, Richard reached into his coat pocket, not hurried, not theatrical, just deliberate, and withdrew a small folder, holding it at his side rather than offering it immediately, as if the gesture mattered less than the reason behind it. "I saw what he did," he continued, his voice steady, "and I realized something I have not seen in a long time," and she watched him carefully now, not with suspicion, but with a quiet need to understand, because men like him did not appear at doors like hers without purpose, and he met her gaze fully, without looking past her, without letting his attention drift. "I saw someone who chose to give when it would have been easier not to," he said, and the word settled into the room behind her, into the worn furniture, the dim light, the quiet life that had held that choice without announcing it to the world. She shifted her weight slightly, her hand moving from the door to rest against the frame. Grounding herself in the moment. "People do what they can," she said softly, and Richard nodded once, acknowledging the truth in it, but not stepping away from what had brought him there. "Not like that," he replied, not dismissing her, but clarifying something deeper, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, the silence not empty but full of the difference between seeing something and understanding it, and then he added, his tone unchanged but carrying more intention now, "I did not come here to thank him," and that shifted the air again, subtle but immediate, and she looked at him more directly, her focus sharpening. "Then why did you come?" she asked, and he did not hesitate, did not soften the answer, because what he gave away yesterday should never have been his last to begin with, and the words did not rise, did not demand, they simply existed, clear and unshaken, and in that moment, something in her posture changed. Not surrender, not relief, but a quiet recognition that whatever was about to unfold, it was no longer just about a single act on a street corner, but about something larger that had already begun to move toward them. The words lingered between them, steady and unforced, and for a moment Ethan's mother did not respond, her eyes searching his face not for status or authority but for intention, something real enough to trust, and Richard did not rush to fill the silence, he let it sit, let it breathe, as the faint noise of the street filtered in behind him, the distant murmur of people who had begun to realize that something unusual was unfolding at a door they had passed 100 times without noticing. She shifted slightly, opening the door wider now. Not as an invitation fully given but as a step closer to understanding, and Richard inclined his head again before speaking, his tone unchanged, grounded. "Your son showed me something yesterday that I have not seen in years," he said, and she listened without interrupting, her posture still guarded but no longer closed. "He gave without asking what he would get back," Richard continued, "and more importantly, he gave when he had every reason not to, and the weight of that truth settled deeper. Now, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just clear," and she exhaled slowly, her gaze lowering for a moment before lifting again. "That is how he was raised," she said quietly, and there was no pride in it, only a simple statement of what had always been, even when there had not been enough to go around. Richard nodded once, acknowledging it, then finally lifted the folder slightly, not thrusting it forward, just bringing it into view. "I cannot change what yesterday was," he said, "but I can make sure it does not happen again," and that shifted something again, more tangible this time, and she looked at the folder, then back at him, her expression tightening just a fraction, not in rejection but in caution. "What does that mean?" she asked, and he answered without hesitation, "It means your son will not have to choose between himself and someone else just to do the right thing." And the simplicity of it made it land heavier than any explanation could have. Outside, a faint breeze moved down the street, brushing against the line of vehicles, carrying with it the quiet tension of a neighborhood watching something it did not yet understand, and inside, the room seemed to hold its breath. Again, the hum of the heater, the soft creak of the floor beneath shifting weight, all of it blending into the moment as she considered his words, not quickly, not impulsively, but with the care of someone who had learned that help often came with conditions that were not always spoken aloud. Richard seemed to recognize that, because he did not step forward, did not press, he simply remained where he was, his presence steady, his gaze level. And after a moment, he added, softer now but no less certain, "This is not about charity," he said, "and it is not about making a statement," and she met his eyes again, searching for any hint that would contradict that, but there was none, only the same calm clarity he had held from the beginning. "Then what is it about?" she asked, and he answered in a way that did not sound rehearsed, did not sound strategic. "It is about recognizing something valuable when I see it, and choosing not to ignore it," and the honesty in that answer did not come from emotion but from conviction, something quieter but harder to dismiss, and for the first time, her shoulders eased just slightly, not fully, not completely, but enough to signal that the distance between them had shifted, even if only by a small step, and as the morning light continued to stretch across the floor behind her, touching the worn edges of the room, it felt like something unseen had already begun to change, not loudly, not suddenly, but in a way that would not easily be undone. The door remained open, just enough for the morning light to stretch across the floor and settle between them, and for a moment neither of them moved, the conversation having reached a place where words no longer needed to push forward, only to exist quietly in what had already been said. And then, slowly, Ethan's mother stepped back, not fully inviting, not fully resisting, just creating space where there had been none before. And Richard understood it for what it was, not permission, not acceptance, but a shift, small and real, and he stepped inside with the same measured calm he had carried from the street, his presence filling the room not with pressure but with contrast, the tailored lines of his coat against the worn edges of the furniture, the quiet certainty in his posture against the quiet resilience that had already lived there long before he arrived. He did not sit, did not reach for anything, he simply placed the folder gently on the small table near the couch, the motion deliberate, unforced, and stepped back again, leaving it there as something to be chosen rather than imposed. Everything is in there, he said, his voice even. Medical care, housing options, school support, all of it structured, transparent, and she looked at the folder but did not touch it right away, her attention moving between it and him, weighing not the offer itself but the intention behind it, and after a moment, she spoke, her voice quieter now but steady. Why? And it was not suspicion that shaped the word, it was something deeper, something that needed an answer that could hold. Richard did not look away, did not soften the truth, because he reminded me of something I chose to forget, he said, and for the first time, there was a trace of something beneath the control, not emotion displayed, but something acknowledged, that doing the right thing is not supposed to depend on how much you have left, and the word settled into the room, into the space where Ethan had lived that truth without ever needing to say it out loud. Hours later, the street had returned to its usual rhythm, the vehicles gone, the attention faded back into routine. But something remained. Something unseen that had already begun to move forward, and when the school bus slowed to a stop at the corner, Ethan stepped off like he always did, adjusting the straps of his backpack, his step steady as he made his way back down the block, the building coming into view just as it always had, unchanged on the outside, familiar in every detail, and he reached the door, pushing it open with the same slight resistance, climbing the stairs without thinking, his mind already drifting toward homework, toward checking on his mother, toward the quiet routine that defined his days. When he stepped inside, the air felt different, not warmer, not louder, just fuller, and he paused for a fraction of a second before moving further in, his eyes landing first on his mother, standing near the window, her posture lighter than he had seen in a long time, and then on the man standing a few feet away, the same man from the street, the same presence now inside his home, and for a moment, everything held still, the connection forming instantly, unmistakable, and Ethan's brows knit slightly in confusion, his voice quiet as he spoke, "Sir," and Richard turned to him. Not with authority, not with distance, but with recognition, the kind that had already been earned, and he nodded once, a simple acknowledgement that carried more than words. "Ethan," he said, and there was no need to explain everything at once, no need to fill the space with promises or details, because the truth of what had begun was already there, present in the room, in the light that now reached further across the floor, in the way Ethan's mother stood just a little straighter, in the quiet understanding that something had shifted. Not because of power, but because of a choice made on a sidewalk when no one was supposed to notice, and as the afternoon light softened against the window, the scene held in stillness, not waiting, not uncertain, just quietly complete, like a moment that did not need to be spoken to be understood.